For those who don't know me, who are new to our workshop series, I'm Dr. Laura Yovine Sykes. I'm a psychologist at the STEP program and director of our STEP Learning Collaborative. In addition to those professional roles related to supporting folks with psychosis, I also identify as a family member of someone with schizophrenia. This is our STEP Family and Community Workshop series, which aims to support and educate families and community members in increasing their understanding and ability to support and empower young people impacted by early psychosis. So this series tonight is brought to you by both our STEP Learning Collaborative, as well as support from the Connecting to Care initiative. And we've got a lot of folks joining us from Favor who are key members in that statewide initiative that works to try to meet the behavioral health needs of all children in our state. And we'll put some links in the chat if you want to check out some of these initiatives a little bit more. So we recognize that we might have an audience coming from varying backgrounds tonight and varying experiences with early psychosis. So some of you might be family members of young people with psychosis at various places in your journey, might be supporting a young person who was newly diagnosed. Perhaps you're a parent who's been well seasoned and already kind of been through many years. A lot of times we have families or community members who are just kind of desperately trying to connect a young person that they care about to care. And we also opened up this workshop to any interested community member or provider who wants to learn how to better support young people with early psychosis. So whatever brings you here tonight, we thank you for your time and we hope that you can find this helpful. So I'd now like to introduce my colleague, Carrie Villette. She is a licensed clinical social worker at the STEP program, and I would consider her an early psychosis expert within our STEP Learning Collaborative. So I'll hand it over to Carrie to introduce our workshop and our panel.
Thanks, Dr. Sykes, for the introduction, and welcome everybody. I'm pleased that so many people can join us tonight. I'm honored to be able to introduce our three presenters this evening. Our first presenter is Ms. Wanda Joffrey. She is a clinical social work associate at the Connecticut Mental Health Center. She has a bachelor's from the University del Sagrado Corazon in Puerto Rico and an MSW from Southern Connecticut State University. Wanda's worked in the mental health field for about 20 years in both residential and clinical settings. She currently works at Connecticut Mental Health Center under the Mobile Crisis Intervention and Evaluation Unit, also known as MCI. She provides in-home and community-based crisis de-escalation services. And also the New Haven and West Haven Police Department, she has partnerships with that she collaborates on crisis intervention services, which we'll certainly talk about more in depth in today's presentation. In addition, she provides the following trainings to various police departments: law enforcement and citizenships with special needs, mental health awareness, and mental health crisis. She also provides mental health training at the statewide CIT trainings offered by Cable. Our next presenter is Lieutenant Michael Fumiati. He currently serves as the City of New Haven as the Fairhaven District Manager, the coordinator for the Crisis Intervention Team, and the officer in charge of the New Haven Police Department's Hostage and Crisis Negotiation Team. As a sergeant, Michael worked as a patrol supervisor until he was promoted to district manager. As an officer, he was assigned to patrol, narcotics, and was a field training officer. Lieutenant Fumiati completed his Bachelor of Science in Criminal Justice from Northeastern University and has a master's in policing and public administration from the University of New Haven. Lieutenant Fumiati is a certified police instructor in the state of Connecticut and frequently lectures regionally in topics related to mental illness, officer wellness and safety, de-escalation and crisis intervention. Lieutenant Fumiati's grandfather and uncle are also both New Haven police officers. And our final presenter is Miss Louise Pyers from Cable. She is the founder and chief executive officer of the CT Alliance to Benefit Law Enforcement, the acronym Cable. It's a statewide nonprofit police community research and education collaborative consisting of public safety and mental health professionals, people living with mental illness at institutions of higher living. Among its many programs, the organization is the sole source provider of crisis intervention team training to federal, state, and municipal law enforcement agencies within Connecticut. Since 2002, Cable has trained over 9,000 police, correctional, probation, and parole officers, judicial marshals, dispatchers, EMS personnel, U.S. Marshals, FBI agents, U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs Police, U.S. Coast Guard Academy Police, universities, and community mental health providers. So cable certainly extends across a wide array of population, as you can see. Louise has also provided mental health awareness training to Connecticut prosecutors and public defenders on topics related to the intersection of the mental health and criminal justice systems. And Louise also holds a master's degree in community psychology and counseling and has worked in the mental health field for over 40 years. She is a board certified expert in traumatic stress. I think at this time, I'll now hand it over to our presenters. Thanks so much.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Dr. Sykes. So like Carrie mentioned, my name is Wanda. I am a licensed clinical social worker at the Connecticut Mental Health Center. And today we will be talking to you about how to navigate mental health crisis in the community. So when we talk about crisis, it is an overwhelming reaction to a threatening situation. It's very personal. What's a crisis to one person may not necessarily be seen like a crisis to someone else. And it usually disrupts their ability to problem solve, so they can't resolve the situation. And this results in a state of disequilibrium. My favorite definition of crisis is represented by the Chinese symbols for crisis, which is danger and opportunity, meaning crisis presents as an obstacle, trauma, or threat, but it also offers the opportunity for either decline or growth. There's different types of crises, right? So there's maturational crises, which happens during life's transition. So for example, going from high school to college can cause some sort of crisis. Getting married can cause some sort of crisis. Getting divorced. These are the different types of crises that can happen. There's also situational crises that are, again, individual to the person, or social crises that can be, for example, natural disasters, riots, wars, or interpersonal crises, which can be assault or rape. But for purposes of this training, we're going to be talking about mental health crises. So when we talk about a mental health crisis, it is a non-life-threatening situation in which an individual is exhibiting the following: extreme emotional disturbance or behavioral distress. They are considering a harm to themselves or others, and they can just be the thought. The thought can also go into an intent or a plan, but just the fact that they're considering is an example of a mental health crisis. They can be disoriented and out of touch with reality. Their reality is different, but it's true to them, whatever it is that they're experiencing. We talk about hallucinations, delusions. It's out of touch for our reality, but for them, that's their reality. These symptoms give them a compromised ability to function, meaning they have problems sleeping, problems with their appetite, they're not able to care for their basic needs. And another symptom can also be that they are agitated and unable to be calmed. When we talk about mental health crises, one of the first things that's identified with the mental health crisis is that the person who is experiencing the crisis is often off their medications and treatment non-compliant. This generally is one of the things that triggers a mental health crisis. Some evidence that a person is experiencing a mental health crisis, again, they can be talking about suicide. They may not necessarily express a plan to kill themselves, but sometimes they say, like, I wish I could go to sleep and never wake up, for example. So that's something that we take into consideration. When they talk about threatening behavior, threatening or aggressive behavior, self-injury that does not necessarily require immediate medical attention. So for example, we have clients who, for example, cut themselves or they bang their heads. So those are some examples of self-injurious behavior. Alcohol or substance abuse within itself is not, a symptom of a mental health issue, but in conjunction with some of these other symptoms can be part of a mental health crisis as well. Their behavior is highly erratic or unusual. We often talk about what's someone's baseline behavior, right? So if their baseline behavior is, they sleep for 4 hours, they eat 1 meal a day, and they have some auditory hallucinations, but now they're only sleeping 1 hour, they're not eating at all, and they're responding to internal stimuli throughout the day. So that's a change in their baseline. So we take that into consideration. Not taking their medications, emotionally distraught, very depressed, etc. Some symptoms of the mental health diagnoses. And then also not being able to take care of their basic needs. So, they're not eating, they're not showering, they're not sleeping, they're refusing to get out of bed. These are all things that can signal a mental health crisis. So what happens, right? What happens when someone is experiencing a mental health crisis? Who do we call? I'm not sure if, what you have heard out there about who you can call. Do I call 211? Do I call 911? What's mobile crisis? What's CIT? Now this year, 988 came out. So what's that? And how do we utilize 988? Last year or 2 years ago, DEMIS released the action line. What's that? Hopefully we will be able to kind of distinguish what the different services are so that you can have a better idea of who to call for what. So when we talk about mobile crisis, so the state is divided in regions. Each region has their own local mental health authority, LMHA. I don't know if maybe you can put that in the chat maybe, with the hopes of providing one number statewide. We talk about the action line. That is something that DEMIS released, I can't remember if it was 1 year or 2 years ago, for access to 24-hour mobile crisis. So the number for the action line is 1-800-HOPE-135 or 1-800-467-3135. This number will link you to 211. So you can call this number or you can call 211. For adults over 18 in distress, it is available 24/7, 365 days a year. And when you call the number, you ask to be directed to adult mobile crisis, and a telephonic clinician will get your information and then patch you through to the agency that covers your area. And then briefly, I want to identify 988. This number was just released in July of this year. It's a nationwide release to have an easier number for people to remember, the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. So there was a 1-800 number for it, and now it is 988. So it's, again, 24/7 access to a trained crisis counselor who will then provide referral to resources or a warm handoff to mobile crisis or emergency services as needed. In Connecticut, 988, again, is covered by 211. So anyone who dials 988 in Connecticut will be transferred to 211 and then transferred to the local mental health authority that covers their area. So who can request a mobile crisis assessment? Anyone can request it. So for us, we get calls from the person in crisis themselves, from family members, friends, other community providers. So there's a misconception that if you're a mental health worker in a clinic or any mental health worker, you can do crisis assessments. That is not correct. In order to be able to do mobile crisis, you have to be a part of a DEMIS run or DEMIS funded agency that is specified in mobile crisis. There's specific trainings, there's specific criteria for mobile crisis clinicians. For example, here in New Haven, we have Cornell Scott Hill Health Center. When they have concerns for their clients because they're not able to do mobile crisis, they will call us to request a mobile crisis assessment for their clients. Neighbors can request mobile crisis. Police officers have called to request mobile crisis assessments. So anyone can really request an assessment when they have concerns for someone in crisis. So the types of mobile crisis calls. When we take a mobile crisis call, we complete a crisis call sheet. And that crisis call sheet is going to help us assess what type of call it is and what type of response it will require. So some of the crisis calls that we respond to, for example, are a wellness check. So for example, here at CMHC, maybe for a STEP client or for one of our other teams, the client has missed several appointments. The clinician's not able to get in touch with them. There's no history of risk. So there's no history of suicide or aggressive behavior or weapons or anything like that. There is no indication that the client needs to go to the hospital. And it's just a way to kind of reconnect with the client, check up on them and say, hey, what's up? We haven't seen you in a while. We'd like to kind of know what's going on. So that's a welfare check or a wellness check. Then we have mobile crisis without police. So when we get the call, we determine that there's no risk or minimal risk for safety. The client is experiencing an increase in symptoms. They want help, the client wants help, but their symptoms impair their ability to come into the office. So we've had clients call and say, I'm so depressed, I can't get out of bed, I want help, I just can't bring myself to come into the office, then that would be an example of a call that we would respond to without the police. Again, they're receptive to the assessment and they're willing to actively engage and participate. When we talk about a co-response with police, these are calls where the client is experiencing a significant increase in symptoms. They can be increasingly agitated, both verbally and physically. There are safety risks. So for example, they have thoughts of suicide, but not just thoughts, but they also have plan or they have intent. There's a history of violence or aggression, or there's a history of weapons. And also for those clients who have high likelihood that to need to be transported to the hospital, but don't want to go. These are examples of calls that we would request with police. And we'll talk a little bit later about, CIT and the training that police have in order to be able to respond to these calls effectively. When to call 911. So when there is imminent risk to self or others, so if the person is actively hurting themselves or actively hurting to someone else, I often tell people when they call us, it can take me anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes to respond to a scene. If you feel that 30 minutes is too long for a crisis response team to respond, like it's imminent and it's urgent, then you need to call 911. And when I tell family members that or loved ones that, I say, call 911, let them know mobile crisis will respond, because there are times that we do respond, but you need to get 911 there before we can get there. So those are the examples of when to call 911. What to say when you have to call 911. The first thing you say is, I'm calling because my loved one, my son, my daughter, my uncle, my aunt, my mom, my dad is experiencing a mental health crisis. Then you describe the crisis. They have schizophrenia, they're not taking their medications, they're not eating, they're not sleeping, and they're hearing voices telling them to jump off a building, for example. You kind of describe it as much as you can, as much as you are able to, right? Because sometimes in crisis situations, we want to be prepared, but the crisis is such that we can't be prepared. But as much as you are able to, be ready to provide any information regarding their diagnosis, their treatment, their medications, what's helpful, what's not helpful, any information that you can provide to make that response as effective as possible. Also, let them know if the person has any known weapons, gun, knives, edged weapons, screwdrivers, or anything that can cause serious injury. This is all going to be helpful for that 911 response to a mental health crisis. You can always request a CIT trained officer. And again, Lieutenant Fumiati and Louise will talk about CIT and the training and what a CIT trained officer is. But just know that they may not necessarily be one available. If there is available, they can dispatch one to the call. So what happens, right? There's a mobile crisis, whether it's through 911, whether it's through 988 or 211. What happens when we arrive on scene? Prior to arriving on scene, we obtain as much collateral information as possible. So we will get information from the call taker. We will get information if they're in treatment. We try to get information from their current treatment providers. We try to get as much information as possible to be able to do the best assessment. We start off with kind of what's going on today. As a crisis clinician, I don't need to know what happened 20 years ago. I need to kind of focus on what's going on today and what triggered this crisis today. We do a mental status exam to assess their orientation, if they know where they are, who they are. Some of them know that exam by, they know the exam by the book. So sometimes when I ask for the date and then I ask for where are we, and they'll say Biden is president and there's 3,000 miles to California. So some of them already know the answers, but that helps us kind of assess their orientation. And then we do a risk assessment. Are they a danger to self? Are they a danger to others? And do they have the ability to care for themselves? And when we assess for risk, we not only assess for the thought, but we also assess for what their plan is, what their intent is, and if they have the means. So for example, a plan would be, I'm having thoughts of suicide and I am planning on jumping off the Quinnipiac Avenue Bridge. Intent. So they have a plan. Intent. I am going to do it on the anniversary of the day that my boyfriend broke up with me, which is in 2 days. That's intent. They have a plan. They have intent on when they're going to do it. And then they have means. Means is I have my car. I'm going to get in my car and I'm going to drive over to the bridge. So someone with that specific plan, intent and means is at a higher risk for suicide. And then, we would kind of do what's called the paper, which I'll explain it in a second. There are times when we assess for risk that's not necessarily that they are a danger to self or danger to others. Sometimes that risk is whether they are able or not able to take care of themselves. So for example, if they're not eating, if they're not sleeping, if they're not meeting their basic needs, if they're not showering. So while they're not expressing verbally, I want to hurt myself or I want to hurt anyone else, their symptoms impair their ability to function so that they can't take care of themselves. And that's what we identify as grave disability. And they may meet criteria for a paper under that area. So when we talk about the paper, right, what's the paper? So right now there is a Connecticut General Statute 17A 503B that specifies that certain people meeting certain criteria can write this emergency certificate. So police officers can write the paper. As of right now, licensed clinical social workers and APRNs who are part of some specific teams and have specific training can write the paper. As of October 1st, I believe, and Louise can correct me, I'm wrong, LPCs and LMFTs who are part of those teams and have the training can also write the paper. For police, it used to be called PEER, Police Emergency Evaluation Request. They have since changed the name to PRE, Police Request for Emergency Evaluation, only because for PEER, there's a lot of things like peer support. There's a lot of things associated with PEER, so they kind of wanted to change the name. So when someone meets criteria for a paper, whether it's a social work paper or a police paper, again, they have to meet criteria of being danger to self, danger to others, or gravely disabled. And what this is a transportation certificate. People have the misconception that, if I write a paper, they're going to be committed for 72 hours. That is not the case. This paper just states, as well as the police paper, that the person needs to be transported to the hospital for further evaluation. And the statute states that the person shall be examined within 24 hours and not be held for more than 72 hours unless they're being committed. So that's again, really the difference between the papers is who's writing it, because it is under the same general statute. So I'm going to pass it over to Louise and Lieutenant Fumiati for what is CIT.
Good evening, everyone. One of the things that we do, so in New Haven, where crisis intervention team training is concerned, there's a couple of different things, and it can be kind of confusing either as a provider or as a consumer of service. And so CIT looks different in each different jurisdiction where you have a different police department. The organization that teaches this and basically across the entire state. And so in the state of Connecticut, officers are trained how to interact with people living with mental illness, how to deal with their own health and wellness, how to engage in the crisis response system. We provide officers with resources, the ability to connect with clinicians and social workers, but also people with lived experience in an effort to really achieve the goal of how do we keep people who are in crisis safe, and how do we get them into services so that they can manage their mental illness the way they do most of the time. And so one of those things is we really look to try to intervene or engage with people, whether it's through officers, but mostly through clinicians and social workers when people are not in crisis. And so what I would recommend is in each of your areas, wherever you live, looking into each of the police departments has CIT officers, and they also have, most of them have CIT coordinators. And so what happens is a CIT coordinator kind of is just piecing together the puzzle that is the mental health system, but also how it works with law enforcement. And so when mobile crisis comes out, with or without law enforcement, those two arms would talk to one another and then be able to work with family members on the best response for them. This whole thing is a real collaborative approach to really ensure the safety of everyone involved. That's Cable's mission from its inception 20 plus years ago. And that's what we're constantly doing with our 40-hour a week training. So we have every month we do a 40-hour training to train officers and all of the clinicians that are responding. Any mobile crisis clinicians in the state of Connecticut are also trained the same way officers are. One, to understand how officers are trained, but then two, to build some of those partnerships and relationships and really embody that whole idea of building partnerships between law enforcement and clinicians. Ideally, Wanda goes out and does her job the way she does it very well all the time. And if she needs the assistance of the police department, great. We're there to provide her with help. We have a relationship. We work with clinicians and social workers, and so it's a working relationship. Whereas what we found is if a random clinician shows up with a random police officer, not that they can't have success, but they are more likely to have success if those relationships are built. Likewise, if a family member is in that piece of the puzzle as well, and they have a relationship with the police officers or they have a relationship with the clinician, that's how we really ensure each of those things is increasing our chance for success and safety exponentially as we increase that. So CIT for law enforcement is a specialized training. It focuses on, it's a 40-hour training. It's really unlike any other training that officers get. Our training is, I don't want to say cutting edge because it stays pretty consistent. It doesn't change drastically. However, we do make changes with the changes in the times and the changes in the community and what we hear. That's why it's so important for us to have feedback from people with lived experience and also clinicians and social workers, because we're training police officers on how to interact with people in crisis. And so the more we see people in crisis, the more we talk to clinicians and social workers on what works, we all kind of learn together, and that makes the training just consistently get better and better. Officers, so CIT officers are specially trained to deal with people living with mental illness, especially when they're in crisis. They also are trained, what we've shown, what we'll show with some of the research that we're conducting, is that we change officers' attitudes towards mental illness. One of the things, there's a huge stigma in our society. I think it's gotten better. However, there's still a huge stigma around mental illness and mental health. And so what we try to do is change officers' opinions about that. We have clinicians who come and talk about it. We have people with lived experience who come and talk about their experiences. And by the end of the 40-hour week, officers really have changed their ideas of what they think mental illness is, and how people with mental illness look, how people with mental illness act. It doesn't fit into a specific category. Anyone can have it. And so it's interesting how officers' perceptions change over time. What it also does is it reduces fear. The general public, in my experience, at times the general public is much more fearful of someone in a crisis than good CIT officers are, because they've seen it before. They recognize it. They realize that it's a mental health crisis. It can be very frightening for the person who's living with the mental illness and is in crisis. It might be the first time that they've been in a crisis. It's really, really helpful for officers to hear that perspective from people who've been in that crisis. It's also really helpful for officers to bring some of their experience to the table. We have some pretty good conversations about officer wellness. On average, there's some studies out there that show that the average person has 2 incidents of trauma in their life. The average police officer sees 800. And so that's a pretty significant number where officers, this training is twofold. It kind of causes them to have some introspection into how they process trauma and deal with their own mental health, but then also it helps them to be more effective when they're interacting with people who are in crisis or family members that are trying to manage a really difficult situation. I think I talked about just about all of that. Yeah, Louise, do we want to tell your story, Louise? Are you okay over there?
If I start coughing, I'll just turn it over to either of you, okay?
Okay,
Been having
Louise.
a little bit of an asthma issue for some reason. Whenever I get on Zoom, this happens. The reason why CIT started in Connecticut, I'll give you the Reader's Digest version of it. I'm not only a clinician, a crisis clinician, an educator in the mental health field, I'm also a family member of a son with bipolar disorder. Initially, when he was a freshman in college, he was diagnosed with a major depressive disorder because we didn't see any of the manic symptoms that one would normally see in bipolar disorder. And after months of talking with our son, his doctor agreed, looks like this is major depressive disorder. He was placed on meds. He was going away to school. He had professional help when he was at school. He was in going to school in New Jersey and was able to maintain a good grade average. He made the dean's list his first semester, was doing quite well, and then started to take a nosedive in his second semester. So he came home. He was seeing his doctor on a monthly basis. He came home from med management, told his doctor that he was not doing well. And so his doctor upped his medication, his antidepressant medication, to kind of see if that would kind of help him, elevate his mood a little bit more so that he was able to continue functioning. He went back to school. Of course, he did not tell us what was going on. He was over 18 at the time. The doctor was of course, because of HIPAA, unable to tell us anything. And he went back to school. Within a week of this happening, he started to become manic. He became very, very suicidal, ended up trying to die by suicide a couple of times that week, was unsuccessful, and thought the only way that he could do this was with a gun. And we didn't have guns in the house. He didn't own a gun, but he knew that the police did. And so he came up with this plan to get the attention of police, to threaten police, so that they would feel threatened enough to shoot him, which is what is known as suicide by cop. And this was his very, very first break. We had never seen behavior like this before. And again, he was away at school, so we didn't even know that this was going on until he drove from New Jersey, because he was trying to get police to stop him on the highway, and nothing was happening. Of course, it was like after midnight, was like 3 o'clock in the morning. So there weren't a lot of people out on the road. And so he ended up driving into Connecticut, to where he knew the police station in our town was. He honked his horn and rolled donuts around the police department to get their attention, which he did, and ended up leading the officers on a high-speed chase. He went through 4 towns and ended up getting the attention of a police department 4 towns north of us. And he then stopped his car. He got the officers, he threatened the officer with a champagne bottle that he had in his car. The officer was backing up into the road, which was the Berlin Turnpike, which it was 4:30 in the morning. However, even though there was no traffic, the officer was situated in the middle of the road at a part where there was a curve that any car coming down the road, especially the officer in his dark uniform, may not be seen, and he could have been hit by a car. So the officer drew his weapon and kept asking him, begging him to drop the bottle. He refused. He advanced towards the officer. The officer told him again, drop the bottle, drop the bottle. He refused. And at that point, as the officer was in the middle line of the turnpike, he shot him. Luckily, the bullet missed all of his major organs. He was shot in the abdomen. How that happened where no major organs were hit, it's still a miracle to us. But he was then taken immediately to Hartford Hospital. One of the things that after our son, he went through a surgery, when he woke up, the first thing he said was, "Please tell that officer how sorry I am." And when when we asked him why, it's kind of like, well, he shot you, why are you sorry? And he said, because of what I saw on his face. And I said, what did you see on his face? And he said, horror. And I realized that I brought him into my nightmare, and I should never, ever have done that. And that really kind of struck us, that while we were in intense grief and suffering over what had just happened to our son, there was somebody else who was affected as well, and it was that police officer. And But what I really desperately wanted to know was, I wanted the police to know that this was not our son. This was not how he usually behaved. He was never in trouble with the law. I wanted them to understand. But then I realized, in order to be understood, I have to seek to understand what police go through. And it took a while. It took some time. But I did everything I could to try to understand. And what happened was, what came out of that was an article that I wrote for the FBI National Academy magazine called Suicide by Cop, The Ultimate Trap. What happened was, after its publication, I got a phone call from a police captain in New London, and who said, have you ever heard of crisis intervention teams? And I said, no. He said, well, what, would you come to New London and come and see what we're doing with it? And I said, absolutely, I would love to. And he introduced me to CIT, crisis intervention teams. He had, New London was the first in New England, the first police agency in New England to implement CIT in their department. And I was just flabbergasted in terms of how the officers interacted with people who were in crisis, how compassionate they were. It was just amazing. And so I asked Captain Edwards if he would help us bring CIT across the state of Connecticut. And he said yes. I will always forever be beholding to him for taking that big giant step to help me and others spread the word about CIT across the state of Connecticut. It wouldn't have happened without him. So I think, part of this was, and I keep going back to it, is seeking to understand so that you can be understood. I think that, in a nutshell, was what happened here. And it really created such a difference in terms of law enforcement accepting what we had to say, and vice versa. We were all learning together. We were all working together for a common goal. And in fact, the officer who shot my son, I had asked him if he wanted to tell his story of that morning at our CIT training. And he said yes. And he did that for 17 years. He came to every single one of our CIT trainings to tell his story. We had our son tell his story on videotape, because it's a story about two individuals, two people, two families, a community where everybody kind of came together to look at, how can we make things better? How can we work together rather than making assumptions about each other, but how can we take the best in each other and create something special? Basically, in 1987, in September, police encountered a young man who was outside of his mother's house, and he was holding a brick. He was throwing bricks at people. And he was, when the police came, he was throwing bricks at the police. He had a reported history of mental illness and substance abuse. He became more and more threatening. He lunged at the officers, and they shot him multiple times, and he was killed. And after that, family members, especially family members of people with mental illnesses, got together along with the University of Memphis and the Memphis PD to look at, okay, how can we take this tragedy and bring people together to look at how can we make this better, and to reduce lethality during police encounters. How can we steer them away from the criminal justice system into community-based treatment? And this is now known as the Memphis model. This is what Connecticut follows, and its training is known as the Memphis model. Basically, we need it because, number one, we know that while deinstitutionalization of people with mental health conditions was a good thing, because where they were in these institutions back in the 50s and 60s, were really not very good places. People were drugged. They were oftentimes forgotten. And they really rarely got the help that they needed. When time came to close the hospitals, there was a promise by the legislature that people who were released from the hospitals would be connected to community-based care. And because people could be treated much, much more effectively and humanely in their own communities. And so what happened was the money didn't follow. The money that was saved from the closing of these institutions did not go, well, not enough went to community-based care, community-based services. So a lot of people fell through the cracks and did not get the help that they needed. So you want to talk a little bit about this piece, Mike?
Sure, Louise. So one of the things that we've seen over the years, you can see a very stark difference in the transition of basically criminalizing mental illness. And so what we did is, if you look at it, what the United States of America did is that in the 50s, with the invention of some effective antipsychotic medications, and also, as Louise just talked about, the deinstitutionalization of people living in the mental health system, we took a group of people that had roughly 560,000 people, and put them out into the public. And so if you look at the number of that 560,000 people, roughly, people who are classified as being severely mentally ill in the 1950s, in 2018, there was only 50,000 people inside a psychiatric hospital. And so what we know about that is that mental illness did not go away. In fact, our population actually grew. And so those numbers would be much higher, but people are more able to adjust and manage their mental illness. Unfortunately, what happens is that the people who were not able to do that, we end up, unfortunately, arresting them and sending them to jail. And so if you look at the transition for people where we house our people who are living with mental illness, unfortunately, that ends up being jail. The largest provider of mental health treatment in the United States of America is the Cook County Jail in Chicago. And so if you think about that, that's a pretty messed up thing to really think about, that a jail is not a therapeutic environment. It is not a place to gain any sort of treatment as far as mental health goes. Yes, it might stabilize somebody for a short time, but there's places that we should be investing in that are much better for somebody to recover from a mental illness, especially with concerns around solitary confinement, etc. Generally, what we do is we show officers this exact slide, and you can see like everyone's reaction is generally the same. That's outrageous. And so we encourage officers to then not arrest people who are living with a mental illness. Obviously, if it's a domestic violence incident or if it's something that, officers have a lot of discretion, we ask them to have a little bit more discretion to be able to work with families. Unfortunately, sometimes too, when the system, if it comes to life or death, a person might need to be arrested to help them stabilize in a situation. I'm not saying that that's the best thing for them, because it's not. But sometimes, unfortunately, that's the only option that officers have in that system. And so also what we do, what Cable does, is advocate for something in between. If you live in New Haven, we have two options, really. Yale, the hospital, or jail. And that's really not what we're looking for. That's not what we need. Something in between, some sort of crisis stabilization center, something where people can go and be safe, but also that they might not necessarily need to go to the hospital. They might not need to be forced to go to the hospital. They might need to be able to stabilize in a location where they can have people that can care for them in a therapeutic environment. That it's a benefit to everyone. Increasing that option for officers, or increasing that awareness for officers, helps them then to understand the perspective of this issue of trying to figure out what to do or how to treat people with mental illness didn't just start yesterday. It didn't just start because they're attending a CIT class. This has been going on now for 70, 80 years. And so what we're trying to do now is find out what the most effective way is to work in that system. And if it doesn't involve law enforcement, what we started to do is transition from the old ways of law enforcement, where we know best and we're not going to ask anybody else. Hey, let's have everyone come to the table, and however you think we can work and make this work as long as it's legal and we have a reasonable way to do it. Let's try to find some new solutions. And I think that environment is a much better environment to work in. Some of the current issues that we see are inadequate resources for those living with mental illness. I think we're getting better at that. It seems like funding is increasing for a couple of those things. Wanda mentioned them earlier, but I still think if you look at how much we fund other things in society, mental health and mental illness is something that's not even close to that. There's also frustration from police officers. Police officers routinely are frustrated with community complaints about people who are living with mental illness. And so when are unhoused people, we've done a disservice to society by telling people to call the police when they have an issue. And sometimes the police aren't the solution to that issue. And so what we're doing now is trying to retrain the public in calling community response teams, community resources that would hopefully be able to be more effective than police officers sometimes, where plugging people into resources, plugging people into services, being able to sit with someone for 2 hours and work through something like that, where police officers oftentimes don't have that amount of time and don't have that amount of the ability to do that. In some cases they do, but in some cases they don't, because there's other calls going. They have to go to motor vehicle accidents or violent crime that's happening. And so I think those are some of the current issues that we've been working to work our way around. I totally agree with you, Lisa. Our police officers in New Haven, Lisa wrote, unfortunately, society has criminalized the unhoused. We struggle with that in New Haven. We try to balance that. The public is not necessarily the most caring and responsive to people's issues around mental illness, especially people who are unhoused and suffering from addiction. So the way CIT works in a perfect world, so what's challenging about CIT is because Connecticut has, I think, 196 towns, maybe, don't quote me on that. There's a lot of towns. So there's a lot of different police departments. There's a lot of different responses. And so, for example, if you're in Milford and you call the police and you ask for a CIT officer, generally, most of the time, they have an officer that's assigned that is just responding to people in crisis. They also have their own social worker or team of social workers. They also have social work interns. So there's different things going on in Milford than are going on in New Haven. The system looks a little bit different. We have CIT officers too, but one, we're generally a little bit more busy. Two, we don't have any social workers that are specifically employed by the police department, but we have a fantastic partnership with Connecticut Mental Health and Wanda and her team. And so in a perfect world, you call the police department a non-emergency number or 911, and the dispatcher screens the call. They recognize that a CIT officer needs to be sent because of whatever terminology you use or terminology that they recommend. What I like about Wanda's presentation is she includes what for family members, what do you say? How do you get a certain response? Because there are things that you say that will dictate how public safety responds. And so by using the right terminology, everyone being on the same page, you lose less in that game of telephone. And so what happens is a CIT officer is then sent, and they can make the assessment on if they need additional resources, if the person needs to be sent to the hospital because it's a crisis, or if follow-up can be done. At this point, we're not going to send the person to the hospital, but let me talk to some of my clinical partners and see if we can determine what the best situation is to get the person in crisis the help that they need. Ideally, we want officers I don't want to say not engaging with people, but we want officers interacting with people when they're a 3 on the crisis scale out of 10. If we can limit the amount that officers are interacting with people when they're at an 8, a 9, or a 10 on the crisis scale, then inevitably we're going to reduce the amount that we have to use force on people. We're going to reduce the amount that officers have to force people to go to the hospital against their will, if we can utilize our partners and utilize clinicians and social workers to interact when the person is, say, a 3, a 4, a 5 on the crisis scale. Then we have much, much better metrics for success in identifying people who are responsive to treatment. And then that way, hopefully we can reduce any of the incidents that we've all heard about, the terrible incidents that sometimes happen.
All right, so just lastly, this is I skipped over some of the slides because I want to leave some time for questions, and it's also stuff that Lieutenant Fumiati and Louise talked about during their presentations. But just lastly, just to give you an example of the benefits of CIT. In 2007 to 2008, there was a study done by the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services of the CIT programs in New Haven, New London, Waterbury, and Hartford. And through those programs, 1,500 persons with mental illness wound up being referred to mental health services. So those are just some of that's just one of the many benefits of the CIT program.
And Wanda, I just want
Yes.
to add that we're currently undergoing more surveys with law enforcement officers who've taken the CIT training. So we will have those numbers in terms of how they see CIT and how it's been helpful to them in terms of their work in the community. So those numbers will be out sometime, probably the end of 2023.
Great, thank you. So with that, that's the end of our presentation. I'll turn it over to Dr. Sykes and Carrie. I see there's lots of questions in the chat.
Sure. Thanks so much, Wanda, Lieutenant Fumiati, and Louise. So does CABLE train families in CIT or other professionals and organizations?
Yes, we do. But basically not specifically families, but what we have done in the past is done some work with NAMI groups, the different NAMI affiliates around the state, to tell them about CIT, what it's all about. Also worked with groups such as IRIS in terms of training social workers how to de-escalate situation when somebody is in crisis. We've worked with librarians as well as and also other public health officials. Again, we don't do the full 40-hour training for them. Basically, going to give them some good insights in terms of how to work with folks who are in crisis, how to de-escalate, and as well as what are the resources that are out there that they can draw from.
I just want to say, Louise, that was such a powerful story, and thank you for sharing that. I really got goosebumps from hearing your story, and I'm impressed with the relationship between the police department and their willingness to go forward, to move forward. This is really something that needs to happen in Connecticut and hasn't happened. And so for this work to go forward, that's impressive. I don't know what else to say. Thank you for sharing your story.
Thanks, Patricia.
Does any part of the CIT include how to work with a person on the spectrum when they are in crisis, and how that could look different than perhaps I hate to use the word typical, but a crisis call?
Yes, we do. We do have a full hour and a half block on working with folks on the autism spectrum. And we have a woman who's also a family member who tells her story. And so we are able to take somewhat of a deeper dive into the autism spectrum and how to work with folks, and we also talk about some of the stereotypes and that you can't rely on them. We also give the officers different things that they might see, like stimming, different types of behaviors that might identify somebody who might be on the spectrum. And we also do, in addition to the 40-hour CIT training, we also have a 2-hour special topics training for CIT officers. And those are done every other month, and we've had another deeper dive into the autism spectrum for those officers who are looking for additional information.
Thank you. Can I add one more question that goes along to what you said? Pat's laughing because she knows. Does any of that, is there a communication between the police that take the CIT and then EMS? Or do EMS take any part of the CIT that's at all?
Not everybody in EMS has taken CIT. A lot of it is due to a lack of being able to send people to the 40-hour training and having not having enough people on the road. So it's more difficult for people who are EMTs or in the EMS system to take it. We have in the past done shorter versions of CIT, like a 4-hour version, to give them some basics. around CIT so that when they see an officer doing something, they'll understand more about what's happening.
I have another question. Going back to the autism spectrum, for those young adults that are driving, I heard that there is a card that they can, so is every police department aware of that card that says, I think it says something like, I'm not trying to be disrespectful, I'm not trying, I am on the spectrum. Does every police department have those cards? I mean, know about the cards?
I know that that's called the Blue Envelope campaign. It was started out by Chief Joe Dooley and Dr. Carrie Sasso at SCSU. They are working towards getting it out to more and more police departments in the state. It's still a work in progress.
You said Central Connecticut State University?
Southern Connecticut.
Southern.
And Dr. Carrie Sasso.
So I think we should have, what we skipped over when I was presenting, I just skipped over the topics that we cover. And so just some of the things that we cover as we go over at length different mental illnesses. What we're most likely to see as a rookie young police officer, I would have thought that everyone had schizophrenia because we were going to calls where people with schizophrenia are having a hard time managing their mental illness. And so we were the most likely to go to those calls. Doesn't necessarily mean that those people are people living with schizophrenia or schizophrenia is the most prevalent mental illness, which I'm sure most of you know. But so that was something that was eye-opening for me when I originally started digging into some of this stuff, was because my perception as an officer was every single call that we go to where someone's in crisis, it seems like they have schizophrenia. Everyone must have schizophrenia. And it's actually because, that's actually like less than 1% of people diagnosed with mental illnesses have schizophrenia. But it's important for officers to know that because they're going to be engaged with them when they're in the midst of a crisis. And so these are some of the things, but not all of the things that we talk about in this class. Generally, we have an expert in the field present on it. And then we have either a clinician, a person with lived experience, generally co-present or assist in presenting sometimes when an officer or an expert in the field can't. And so these are just some of the things that we talk about over the course of the 40-hour week. We're always looking to add in additional things and keep with the freshest, newest strategies that are out there to engage with people living with mental illness and crisis.
Is any part of the training have a slide or a topic on how culture and ethnicity can play a role in crisis and how services are received or how you interact and being mindful about culture?
Yes, we include some of that. What's interesting about that is we did a training up at Foxwoods. What we've tried to do, we did a training up at Foxwoods last month, Louise, 2 months ago. And so it's interesting, we really do try to look at how can we cater the training to people in that area. So we try to bring clinicians for that area. You are pretty unlikely in New Haven to run across someone who is a Native American, or you're definitely not going to come to a reservation in New Haven. But up in that area of the state, officers would be interacting with people of tribal populations quite frequently. And so what we've tried to do is in each area, try to bring in some of that culture. While it's not the main focus of CIT, we recognize that some of those things are very important to talk about. Especially in communities of color, especially in an urban environment, especially around law enforcement and understanding that people are not, I love being a police officer, I love this uniform, but there's people who don't feel that way. And so understanding that and not being insensitive to that, but then also not being offended when people think a certain way or think differently is all part of what we talk about in the training. And also really the training is to kind of shift from standard law enforcement training, which is generally confrontational, because we have to, at some points in our jobs, we have to tell people who are doing something no. And so that can be difficult to manage. And so the majority of our training is focused on that. This training is more focused on what you were before you were a police officer and the humanity behind that. And so it really is a juxtaposition between bringing those two worlds together. That's really what we try to hope officers walk away with at the end of the week. Really more well-rounded around partnerships and understanding different people's perspectives. I don't know if that was a very long-winded way of answering that question, but I hope I was able to.
And what's also helpful is that because the training is held in different parts of the state, having not only the officers from those areas, but having the clinicians or the mobile crisis teams from those areas attend the training and also help with the training so that they can identify some of those cultural pieces and how it would be helpful for officers to respond in those situations. So for example, when the training is held in New Haven County, I try to attend several days of the training or several parts of the training so that I can assist with some of those things and as the clinician who provides the service.
So Dr. Sykes, I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. Again, Wanda, Louise, Lieutenant Fumiati, it was great to have you guys. It's always great to have you. It's super informative. And, you know, I'm sure we'll be in communications again to present the next few months or so for another population.